My husband said it at the kitchen table on a Sunday morning, the way people say things they have been rehearsing for weeks. You own nothing in this marriage. He laughed after he said it. Not a cruel laugh, the easy laugh of a man who believes he has just stated a fact. 4 years before that Sunday morning, I had refinanced our house. My husband signed every document without reading a single page, including the deed. He never knew whose name was on it. My name is Laura Hendricks. I am 44 years old. I am a real estate attorney, and the morning my husband told me I owned nothing, the deed to our home had carried my name and only my name for 4 years. Drop your city in the comments right now. Tell me what time it is where you are. And stay with me to the end, because the look on my husband's face when his own attorney read that deed out loud is something I have never forgotten and never will. My husband, Thomas Hendricks, was a contractor. He built things, commercial projects, office developments, the kind of work that required him to read blueprints and manage crews and negotiate with suppliers. He was good at it. He understood structures, how things were built, how they held together, what made them strong. He had never once read a legal document all the way through in the 11 years we were married. I noticed this early. The first time we signed a lease together, he initialed every page without reading a single line. When we refinanced our car, he signed where I pointed without asking what he was signing. He trusted me to handle the paperwork. He said it was because I was the attorney in the family. What it actually meant was that he had no idea what the paperwork said. I want to tell you about the house, because the house is where everything started and where everything ended. We bought it 9 years ago. A 4-bedroom colonial on a quiet street in a neighborhood I had researched carefully. It was exactly what I had been looking for: good bones, mature trees, a kitchen that needed updating, but rooms that didn't. Thomas walked through it once, nodded, and said he liked it. The offer, the inspection, the title work, the closing, I handled all of it. Because I handle real estate transactions for a living, and it was faster and cleaner for me to do it myself. At closing, we were listed as joint tenants with right of survivorship, both names on the deed, standard for a married couple. Then came the refinance. 5 years into the marriage, interest rates dropped significantly, and I refinanced the mortgage to reduce our monthly payment. It was a routine transaction. I managed it entirely. Thomas signed the new loan documents at the kitchen table one evening without looking at them. He trusted me, he said, and he had a project call in 20 minutes. What Thomas did not know was that during the refinance process, I had restructured the title. Not secretly, not illegally. The documents were filed with the county recorder's office where anyone could look them up. I had notified the mortgage company. Everything was above board and fully disclosed to every party that had a legal right to know. Thomas simply never asked. The reason I restructured the title was professional, not personal. I had a client at the time whose spouse had encumbered a jointly owned property with a personal judgment lien without the other spouse's knowledge. The case was a nightmare to untangle, and it cost my client significantly. After resolving it, I reviewed my own property holdings and made adjustments I considered prudent from a liability standpoint. The house was retitled in my name alone as part of that review. It was a sound legal decision, and I intended to discuss it with Thomas when the right moment arrived. At first, I intended to raise it soon. But as the years passed and his language around ownership became increasingly pointed, I realized the conversation no longer served any purpose. He had formed his conclusions. I decided to wait until those conclusions became relevant, because somewhere in the year that followed, Thomas changed. I do not know exactly when it started. These things rarely have a clean starting point. But across the 5th and 6th years of our marriage, something shifted in how Thomas spoke to me. Small things at first. A dismissiveness in conversations about finances. A tendency to speak over me at dinner parties when the subject turned to property or law. a habit of referring to my career as your little practice, not mean enough to confront directly, not kind enough to ignore. By year 7, I had noticed a pattern. Thomas had decided, somewhere along the way, that because he earned more money in years when his projects were running well, the marriage's assets were primarily his. He did not say this directly for a long time. It lived in implications, in the way he spoke about my investment in the house, in the way he told friends about the property I own at dinner. I said nothing. I am, by training and by temperament, a person who waits until she understands the full picture before speaking. I kept working. I kept filing. I kept records the way I keep all records, carefully, completely, with an eye toward a future in which they might need to be read by someone other than me. Then came the Sunday morning. We had been arguing calmly, the way people argue when they have been arguing the same argument for months and all the heat has gone out of it. The subject was the house. Thomas wanted to sell it and buy something larger in a different neighborhood. I did not. He had been pushing the point for several weeks, and that Sunday morning he reached for what he believed was his final word on the matter. You own nothing in this marriage, he said. I built everything. The house, the investments, all of it. You manage paperwork. That is not the same as building something. He laughed. It was a relaxed laugh, the laugh of a man who believes the conversation is over. I looked at him across the table. I thought about the deed sitting in my file cabinet in the office down the hall. I thought about the county recorder's stamp on the lower right corner. I thought about the 4 years during which Thomas had referred to my house and my property without once verifying whose name was actually on it. I said, I'd like you to look at something. I want to pause here for a moment, because I know what some of you are thinking. You are thinking that I should have told him 4 years earlier, that a marriage requires transparency, and that what I did, even if technically legal and professionally justified, was a form of withholding. I have thought about this. I thought about it during the liability review when I made the decision. I thought about it in the years that followed. I thought about it on that Sunday morning. Here is what I know. I made a sound legal decision for sound legal reasons. What I also did, as the years passed and his language around ownership became more pointed, was decide that the appropriate time had not yet arrived. That is a decision I made, and I own it. What I did not do was lie. The deed was filed. It was public record. Anyone who wanted to know whose name was on our house had access to that information. Thomas had access to it for 4 years. He simply never looked. I went to my office. I came back with a single document. I placed it on the table in front of him. He looked at it. He picked it up. He read the first paragraph. Then he read it again. Then he looked at me. What is this? That's the deed to the house. He stared at it. I watched him find the grantee line. I watched him read the name on it. I watched him read it a second time. This only has your name. Yes, why does this only have your name? I explained calmly and completely the liability restructuring I had done 4 years earlier, the client case that had prompted it, the legal basis for the decision, the fact that the change had been properly recorded and disclosed to the mortgage company. Thomas said nothing for a long moment. Then he said, "You didn't tell me. At first I intended to discuss it with you. But as the years passed and your opinions about ownership became clearer, I realized the conversation no longer served any purpose. I decided to wait until it became relevant." He looked at the deed. He looked at me. He set the paper down on the table between us. "So, I own nothing," he said. "That's what the deed says." The conversation we had that Sunday morning was the beginning of the end. Not because of the deed was a document, not a relationship, but because of what the deed revealed about what we had each believed we were building. Thomas retained an attorney. So did I, a colleague I trusted completely. The divorce process was not without difficulty. Thomas was convinced for the first 3 weeks that the title situation was a legal error that would be corrected in his favor. His attorney reviewed the documents and explained, as gently as attorneys explain these things, that it was not an error. The deed was valid. The filing was proper. The liability restructuring had been handled correctly. Thomas owned 50% of the marital equity in a house that was titled in my name, which meant the division required my cooperation and agreement rather than a court simply ordering a sale. That distinction mattered in the negotiation. We reached a settlement after 3 months. Thomas received his equitable share of the marital assets, including his portion of the home equity, the value of which we agreed on through appraisal. What he did not receive was the ability to force a sale or dictate terms, because the property was not titled in a way that gave him that unilateral power. His attorney, to his credit, was professional throughout. In our final settlement meeting, he said something to Thomas that I have thought about since. He said, in real estate transactions, the deed is the document that matters. Everything else is conversation. Thomas moved to an apartment across the city. We divided the furniture in a single afternoon, more efficiently than I expected. He took the pieces he had brought into the marriage and the items he felt strongly about. I kept what remained. The process was quiet. By the time the movers left, the house felt different, not empty, but settled, like a room after a long conversation has finally ended. I took a week off work after the settlement closed, the first real week off I had taken in 3 years. I walked in the neighborhood in the mornings and sat on the porch in the evenings and felt, for the first time in a very long time, that the space around me was entirely my own. Not because Thomas was gone, because I had stopped managing the distance between who I was and who the marriage required me to perform being. We have not spoken since the settlement was finalized. I still have the house. The kitchen has been updated now. The trees are larger. The neighborhood is still quiet. And the deed still says what it said when Thomas laughed on that Sunday morning and told me I owned nothing in our marriage. It says my name, just my name, the same way it has for the past 4 years. Now tell me, if someone told you that you owned nothing, that everything around you had been built without you, what would you do? Would you argue? Or would you put one document on the table and let it speak? Tell me in the comments. And tell me the city you are watching from. I want to see how far Laura's story has traveled. Subscribe before you go. More stories are coming that you will not want to miss.